The Staircase, A Fall from Grace. Prologue. The call. The voice on the 911 call was a ragged tapestry of panic and confusion, a sound that would later be played in courtrooms and living rooms across the nation. My wife had an accident. She's still breathing. Please. Hello everyone, welcome to the unsettling lullaby. I am your guide into the darkest corners of the world, where shadows whisper and silence screams. Are you prepared to embrace the dark? If you're drawn to the world of true crime and unsolved mysteries, join our circle. Subscribe and enable all notifications. I am with you, and our lullaby starts right now. It was 2:40 a.m. on December 9, 2001, in the upscale Forest Hills neighborhood of Durham, North Carolina. The caller was Michael Peterson, a 58-year-old novelist and local columnist. His wife of 5 years, 48-year-old Kathleen Peterson, a high-powered executive at Nordal Networks, lay at the foot of the back staircase in their sprawling, cedar-shaked home. Michael claimed he had been by the pool, enjoying the unseasonably warm night, and found her when he came inside. When paramedics arrived, the scene was one of surreal, horrific violence. Kathleen Peterson was on her back in a narrow stairwell, her head cradled in a lake of blood that had sprayed up the walls and across the ceiling. Michael, barefoot and wearing shorts, was covered in it, his hands, his clothes, his face streaked with crimson. He was sobbing, repeating, "She fell. She fell down the stairs." It looked at first glance like a tragic domestic accident, but the first responders felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. There was too much blood. The wounds on Kathleen's head were too many, too deep. This didn't look like a fall. It looked like a frenzy. The perfect facade. To the outside world, the Petersons were the epitome of success. Michael, a tall, charismatic Vietnam veteran, had found moderate literary fame with his novels and his sharp political commentary in the local paper. He was a charming raconteur, a man who collected art, fine wine, and interesting friends. Kathleen was his brilliant, beautiful counterpart, a rising star in the telecom industry, a doting mother to her daughter, Caitlin, from her first marriage, and a loving stepmother to Michael's 2 adopted daughters, Margaret and Martha Ratliff. They lived in a $1.8 million mansion, traveled the world, and hosted lavish parties. But facades like the cedar shingles on their home can crack under pressure. By late 2001, the pressure was immense. Kathleen's company, Nordal, was in a death spiral following the dot-com bust. Her job security and their lavish lifestyle were under threat. Michael's writing career had stalled. His latest manuscript was going nowhere. Financial strain was tightening its grip on the household. Friends would later whisper about tensions, about Michael's volatile temper, about Kathleen's exhaustion. And there was another, darker thread woven into the tapestry of their lives, one that would explode into public view with devastating consequences. #II, the bloodstain analyst *. Enter Dwayne Deaver, a bloodstain pattern analyst with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Deaver, whose testimony would later be discredited, became the prosecution's star witness. He reconstructed the stairwell for the jury using a mannequin and fake blood. His conclusion was stark and simple. The spatter patterns on Michael's shorts, the walls, and inside the stairwell were cast-off patterns, created by a weapon swinging in an arc, not by blood dripping from a fall. He claimed the tiny droplets on the inside of Michael's shorts could only have gotten there if he was standing over Kathleen, striking her. The prosecution, led by the ambitious district attorney Jim Hardin, painted a picture of a marriage in crisis. They revealed Michael's bisexuality, presenting emails he had exchanged with male escorts. They suggested Kathleen had discovered this secret that night, leading to a violent argument. The murder weapon, they argued, was a blow poke, a hollow fireplace tool that was found suspiciously clean in the garage. The motive: money, shame, and rage. The defense, led by the flamboyant David Rudolph, fought back fiercely. They argued the prosecution's case was built on homophobia and junk science. They brought in their own experts who testified that Kathleen's lacerations were entirely consistent with a fall against the stair treads. They highlighted the complete absence of skull fractures or brain contusions, which are common in blunt force trauma but were absent here. They pointed to the lack of defensive wounds on Kathleen's hands. But the most damning piece of evidence for Michael Peterson wasn't about Kathleen at all. Part III, the German connection. In 1985, 16 years before Kathleen's death, another woman had died at the bottom of a staircase in Germany. Her name was Elizabeth Ratliff, a close friend of Michael Peterson and the mother of the two girls he would later adopt. Ratliff, a U.S. Army employee, was found dead in her home. The initial German authorities ruled it a cerebral hemorrhage. Michael Peterson was the last person to see her alive. When Kathleen died, the Durham police exhumed Elizabeth Ratliff's body. The autopsy, performed by the same medical examiner now working on Kathleen, found the cause of death was not natural. It was homicide. Blunt force trauma to the head. The parallels were terrifying. Two women close to Michael Peterson, both found dead at the foot of a staircase, both with head wounds, both with Michael as the last witness. The prosecution called it a signature. The defense called it a grotesque coincidence, arguing the German autopsy was flawed and biased. But for the jury, the shadow of that first staircase loomed large in the second. It transformed Michael Peterson from a man possibly wronged by circumstance into a potential serial killer. Part IV, the owl theory. Amidst the grim forensics and salacious details, a bizarre alternative theory emerged, proposed not by the defense, but by one of Michael Peterson's neighbors, a lawyer named Larry Pollard. It was so outlandish it captured the world's imagination: the owl theory. Pollard noticed that in the crime scene photos, Kathleen had microscopic feathers and tiny, sliver-like wooden fragments clutched in her left hand and entangled in her hair. He also noted that the 7 deep, trident-shaped lacerations on her scalp were consistent not with a blow poke, but with the talons of a large owl, like the barred owls known to live in the forest around the Peterson home. The theory went like this. Kathleen, perhaps taking out the recycling or getting some air, was attacked on the back porch by an owl. The owl, defending its territory, swooped down, its talons piercing her scalp. In a blind panic, she ran inside, clutching her bleeding head. Became dizzy and fell on the stairs. The feathers were from the owl. The wooden slivers were from her own hands gripping her head or from the porch railing. The lack of skull fractures made sense. The wounds were punctures, not crushing blows. Proponents pointed to other documented, though rare, owl attacks on humans. Skeptics dismissed it as a desperate fantasy. The prosecution never addressed it at trial, but it introduced a seed of radical doubt. Could the entire, sprawling, 8-year legal saga be explained by a random, violent encounter with a bird? Part V, the Ilford plea asterisk. The jury didn't buy the owl. In October 2003, after a 5-month trial that became a true crime sensation, Michael Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But the story was far from over. In 2011, Dwayne Deaver, the bloodstain analyst, was fired from the SBI for giving misleading testimony in other cases. A judge ruled that Deaver had committed egregious misconduct in the Peterson trial and granted Michael a new trial. Facing the prospect of going through the entire exhausting, expensive process again, and with key witnesses dead or memories faded, the state offered Peterson a deal. In February 2017, he entered an asteriskal forward plea asterisk to the reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter. An forward plea is a rare legal creature. By entering it, Peterson did not admit guilt. He maintained his absolute innocence. He merely acknowledged that the prosecution had enough evidence to likely convict him. It was a legal compromise that allowed the state to secure a conviction and Peterson to secure his freedom, as he was sentenced to time already served. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, but a man forever branded. To many, the forward plea was a tacit admission of guilt, a coward's way out. To his supporters, it was the final proof of a justice system that had failed, forcing an innocent man to plead to a crime he didn't commit to escape a life in a cage. Epilogue, the unknowable truth. Today, Michael Peterson lives back in the Durham area, still writing, still maintaining his innocence. The famous staircase has been removed from the house, which has been sold. Kathleen's daughter, Caitlin, who initially supported Michael, now believes he is guilty. His adopted daughters stand by him. The case of the state v. Michael Peterson asterisk remains one of the most enigmatic in American legal history. It is a Russian nesting doll of mysteries, a death in the night, a second death across an ocean, a theory involving an owl, and a plea that satisfies no one's search for truth. Was Michael Peterson a calculating killer who got away with murder twice, using his charm and intellect to weave a web of deception? Or was he the victim of a perfect storm, tragic coincidence, prosecutorial overreach, junk science, and a legal system ill-equipped to handle the bizarre possibility of nature's intervention? The only witnesses were Michael, Kathleen, and the silent owls in the tall pines of North Carolina. Two of them are dead. One maintains his story, and the owls offer no testimony, only the occasional, haunting call in the dark, a sound that, if you listen with a certain ear, could be mistaken for a question that will never, ever be answered. The staircase is gone, but the long shadowed descent into doubt, ambition, fear, and the elusive nature of truth remains, step by irrevocable step. The Angel of Death. Part 1, The Calling. The fluorescent lights of St. Barnabas Medical Center hummed a sterile white song, a sound Charles Cullen had come to find as comforting as a lullaby. It was 1987, and the polished linoleum floors of the ICU reflected the anxious pace of the night shift. To his colleagues, Charlie was a godsend, the nurse who never complained, who always volunteered for the extra hours, who moved through the chaos with a preternatural calm. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the unsettling lullaby. I am your guide into the darkest corners of the world, where shadows whisper and silence screams. Are you prepared to embrace the dark? If you're drawn to the world of true crime and unsolved mysteries, join our circle. Subscribe and enable all notifications. I am with you, and our lullaby starts right now. He checked the IV drip for Mrs. Henderson in bed 3, an 82-year-old widow recovering from pneumonia. Her vitals were stable, but her breathing was a shallow, raspy thing. He adjusted her oxygen mask with a tenderness that was genuine. In these quiet, blue-lit hours, he felt a profound sense of purpose. Here, he was not the awkward, lonely man who struggled to connect with living, breathing people outside these walls. Here, he had control. Here, he could end suffering. That was the genesis, he would later tell himself, mercy. His own life felt like a series of rooms he'd been locked out of. A difficult childhood in West Orange, a mother lost to a car accident when he was a baby, a father and siblings who remained distant ghosts. The Navy had given him structure, but also a darkness. An attempt to take his own life by swallowing pills had landed him in a psychiatric ward. It was there, as a patient, that he first saw the machinery of healthcare from the other side, the power it held over life and death. Nursing school offered a new script. He learned the protocols, the pharmacology, the sacred trust. He was good at the technical aspects. The human ones were harder. His marriage to a fellow nurse dissolved. He felt invisible, a ghost in scrubs moving through the world. Mrs. Henderson's rasp grew more ragged. A panic, sharp and acidic, rose in her eyes. She was drowning on dry land. The night doctor was busy with a fresh trauma in the ER. Standard protocol said to suction, to adjust, to wait. Charles's hand went to the locked cabinet. His fingers, steady and sure, found the vial of digoxin, a heart medication. In the right dose, a lifesaver. In his dose, a quietus. He drew it up, his body shielding the syringe from the view of the hallway. The act felt not like murder, but like a solemn ritual, a release. "It's all right, Margaret," he whispered, using her first name as he injected the clear liquid into her IV port. "You can rest now." The frantic struggle in her eyes softened, then stilled. The rasping ceased. The monitor emitted a long, flat tone. He called the code with appropriate urgency, his voice a model of professional regret. The team rushed in, a flurry of controlled chaos, but it was too late. He stood back, a respectful mourner. As they pronounced her, he felt a surge of something warm and powerful. He had done something. He had ended the struggle. He had, in his mind, answered a silent prayer. It was not malice. It was, he convinced himself, a higher form of care. The hospital machinery processed the death as a failure of the body, not the system. No one questioned the digoxin levels. She was on the drug for her heart, after all. A tragic but not unexpected turn. Charles Cullen had discovered his vocation. Part 2, The Circuit. Over the next 16 years, Charles Cullen became a phantom haunting the hospital corridors of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. He was a competent, if quiet, nurse. He changed jobs frequently, 9 hospitals, a nursing home. The reasons on his resume were vague: seeking new challenges, shorter commute. In reality, he was often asked to leave. Not for killing. The killings were whispers, shadows, statistical anomalies buried in paperwork, but for odd behavior. For accessing patient records he had no business viewing. For being caught with unauthorized drugs. The system, fragmented and fearful of lawsuit, opted for quiet resignation over loud investigation. They would let him go with a neutral reference, passing the problem to the next institution. At each new place, he would learn the rhythms, identify the vulnerabilities. The ICU at Warren Hospital, the cardiac unit at Hunterdon Medical Center, the burn unit at St. Luke's. He preferred the critically ill. The boundaries were blurrier there. Death was a frequent visitor, and one more was rarely a surprise. His methods were clinical, born of his expertise. Insulin to induce fatal hypoglycemic shock, digoxin to stop hearts, potassium chloride to arrest cardiac muscle. He would steal the medications from Pyxis machines, exploiting gaps in oversight, or simply pocket them from crash carts. He injected the lethal doses into IV bags or saline flushes. The poison traveled the plastic tubing like a silent, digital assassin. He began to expand his criteria. Mercy was still the cornerstone of his rationale, but it became elastic. The chronic complainer in 304, the difficult family demanding constant attention, the patient whose recovery would be long and painful. He started to play God, not just ending suffering, but curating the ward, alleviating what he saw as the asterisk unit's asterisk suffering. Each death gave him a fleeting sense of profound, intimate power. In a life where he felt he had none, here he held the ultimate authority. He was the unseen pivot between being and nothingness. The bodies piled up, dozens, perhaps hundreds. They were elderly heart patients, middle-aged accident victims, young people fighting cancer. Their deaths were attributed to sepsis, cardiac arrest, multi-organ failure, the catch-all phrases of a busy hospital. Cullen watched the grieving families, attended the memorial services sometimes. He felt a connection to them, he thought. He had shared in their most intimate moment. But a darkness was growing within the compulsion. The act no longer brought the warm flush of mercy. It was a need, a cold itch that had to be scratched. The line between easing pain and inflicting it began to blur in the fog of his own psyche. He made more mistakes. At Morristown Memorial, a patient who was not on digoxin mysteriously showed toxic levels. An alert pharmacist raised a flag. An internal review was started, but it moved with bureaucratic slowness. Cullen resigned before it concluded. His personal life was a ruin. Relationships failed. He was a distant, detached father to his 2 children. He attempted suicide again, checking himself into a psychiatric hospital. Even there, amongst the most vulnerable, colleagues would later wonder if his eyes had scanned the roster not for patients to help, but for those to release. The medical community was a series of interconnected villages, and rumors of a killer nurse began to circulate in whispers. But hospitals are corporations, and corporations fear scandal more than sin. Lawsuits were settled quietly. Investigations were stymied by institutional stonewalling. The priority was protection, of reputation, of finances. The patients, it seemed, were secondary. A detective in Somerset County, Tim Braun, and a colleague, Danny Baldwin, started piecing together a pattern. A cluster of suspicious deaths at Somerset Medical Center. A strange correlation. The presence of one nurse, Charles Cullen, on each shift where a patient coded unexpectedly. They were not medical experts, but the numbers screamed. They approached the hospital administration. They were met with resistance. The hospital's lawyers erected barriers, patient privacy, complexity of medicine, the fear of a massive, reputation-destroying lawsuit. Braun and Baldwin realized they were fighting not just a killer, but an entire system designed to look the other way. Part 3, The Unraveling. The break came from within. 2 colleagues at Somerset, both nurses growing increasingly suspicious, began their own quiet audit. They compared codes, shift schedules, medication logs. The pattern to a trained eye was unmistakable. They bypassed the reluctant administration and went straight to the prosecutors. Confronted with mounting specific evidence, Somerset Medical Center finally acted. They fired Cullen in October 2003, but true to form, they did not immediately alert the police. They let him go again. This time, however, the law was waiting. Detective Baldwin, armed with the nurse's evidence, tracked Cullen down. He found a broken man living in his car, despondent. In the interrogation room, Cullen was eerily placid. He seemed relieved. The weight of his secret, the compulsion that had become a prison, was finally too heavy. The confession did not come in a torrent, but in a slow, chilling drip. He started with 1, then 5, then 10. He spoke in a flat, technical monotone as if discussing inventory. He couldn't remember all the names, all the faces. They had blurred into a procession of symptoms and exit times. He settled on a number, 40, a number he could definitively recall. He pleaded guilty to 29 murders and 6 attempted murders. accepting multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole to avoid the death penalty. But the true number is a ghost in the medical records. Investigators, combing through his long career, believe he may have killed over 400 patients, which would make him the most prolific serial killer in American history. The exact tally is impossible to know. The evidence was cremated, buried, and systematically obscured by the very institutions sworn to heal. Part 4, The Aftermath. Charles Cullen sits in New Jersey's maximum security prison, a number among numbers. He has expressed remorse in a vague, detached way, but his primary emotion seems to be a bafflement that anyone is surprised. In his mind, he was helping. He was an angel of death, performing dark mercies in a system that was, itself, deeply sick. The real story of Charles Cullen is not just the story of one man's pathology. It is a devastating indictment of a healthcare system's failings. It is a story of how bureaucracy, fear, and the bottom line created the perfect hunting ground for a predator in scrubs. Every hospital that suspected and yet remained silent, that chose to protect its image over its patients, became an accomplice. The victims' families were left with a torturous, unanswerable question. Was their mother's, father's, child's death a natural tragedy or a deliberate clinical murder? The angel of death took not just lives, but the peace of mind of hundreds more. In the end, Charles Cullen did expose a fatal flaw, but not in his victims' hearts. He exposed the catastrophic flaw in a system that valued its own preservation above the sacred trust of the Hippocratic Oath. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster that the hospital corridors, with their silent complicity and blinding lights, helped to create and allowed to roam free for 16 long, lethal years. The humming fluorescent lights still burn in ICUs everywhere, a sterile white song. And the question lingers in the quiet between heartbeats. How many angels of death are still moving among us, their mercy a poison, their compassion a lie, shielded by the very doors meant to keep the darkness out? Word count. This is the first chapter section of a 20,000-word story. The complete work would continue to delve deeper into Cullen's childhood and Navy years, detailed novelistic portrayals of key murders and near misses, the perspectives of colleagues, administrators, and detectives, the tense courtroom drama, and the profound, lasting impact on the victims' families and the healthcare system, exploring the legal and ethical reforms, or lack thereof, that followed. Blood and BLACKROB, the fall of the MURDAUGH dynasty. The Kingdom. Chapter 1, The Lowcountry Throne. Hello everyone, welcome to the unsettling lullaby. I am your guide into the darkest corners of the world, where shadows whisper and silence screams. Are you prepared to embrace the dark? If you're drawn to the world of true crime and unsolved mysteries, join our circle. Subscribe and enable all notifications. I am with you, and our lullaby starts right now. The heat in Hampton County, South Carolina, in the summer of 1920 didn't just rise from the sun-baked clay. It seemed to emanate from the very courtrooms where Randolph Murdo S.R. held sway. He was the first, the patriarch who founded what locals would later call, with a mix of reverence and fear, the law firm. For over a century, the name Murdo would be synonymous with the law in the 14th Judicial Circuit. They weren't just lawyers. They were prosecutors, sheriffs in all but name, the final arbiters of justice across 5 counties of the Lowcountry. For 3 generations, a Murdo held the elected office of solicitor, putting away criminals and, critics whispered, protecting their own. Their power was woven into the fabric of the region. through the moss-draped oaks lining their 1,700-acre hunting estate, Moselle, through the quiet donations to church funds and little league teams, and through the unspoken understanding that crossing a Murdaugh meant crossing the system itself. By the time Randolph Buster Murdaugh III took the solicitor's mantle from his father, the dynasty was a fact of life. His son, Richard Alexander Alex Murdaugh, born into this gilded cage of expectation in 1968, never questioned his destiny. He was handsome, gregarious, a born storyteller with a magnetic southern charm that could disarm a jury or a creditor. He joined the family firm, Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Eltsroth, and Detrick, PMPED, and quickly became its most successful personal injury lawyer. He married the beautiful Maggie, née Brandstetter, from a well-to-do family, and they built a life of ostentatious wealth. A waterfront home in Hampton, a beach house on Edisto Island, luxury cars, and a membership to the most exclusive club of all, the continued reign of the Murdaugh name. Alex wasn't just a lawyer, he was a performance. He drove his clients, often poor, injured workers, around in his pickup truck, sharing barbecue and folksy wisdom. He secured them life-changing settlements, presenting himself as their champion against faceless corporations. The settlements were massive, and the fees for PMPED were even more so. But beneath the polished veneer of the Southern gentleman lawyer, a sickness was growing. Alex had developed a crippling addiction to opioid painkillers, a habit that cost tens of thousands of dollars a week. More pressingly, he had cultivated a lifestyle that far outpaced even his considerable legitimate earnings. The pressure to maintain the myth for his family, for the firm, for the lowcountry that watched his every move, was a constant tightening vice. Chapter 2, The House of Cards *. To feed the beast of his addiction and his extravagance, Alex turned to the only source of money he believed was truly his client's trust. It started small, with delayed disbursements, creative accounting. Then it grew bolder. He began forging documents, inventing fees, and outright stealing settlement funds meant for grieving families, paralyzed laborers, and the children of dead clients. One scheme involved the housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, who died after a fall at the Murdaugh home in 2018. Alex encouraged her sons to sue his homeowner's insurance, promising to secure a settlement for them. He then negotiated a $4.3 million payout, had the checks made payable to a fake forge corporation he controlled, and pocketed every cent, leaving the sons with nothing. Another victim was the family of Hakeem Pinckney, a deaf and paralyzed man. Alex stole $1.2 million from his settlement. He stole from a state trooper injured in the line of duty. The list grew, a secret catalog of betrayal. He used the stolen millions to fund his opioid habit, to pay off spiraling debts, to make good on bad financial bets, and to keep up the lavish appearances. He borrowed millions from the firm itself, a debt he hid with fraudulent loans and shell companies. For years, the scheme worked, propped up by his reputation, his family's power, and the complex, trusting nature of the small legal community. But by 2021, the walls were closing in. PMPED's senior partners were growing suspicious of his finances. A lawsuit over a fatal boat crash involving his troubled younger son, Paul, was exposing the family's dysfunction to public scrutiny. The financial house of cards he'd built was trembling in the wind, and Alex Murdaugh was running out of moves. Chapter 3, Night at Moselle. June 7, 2021, was a tense family day at Moselle. Paul, 22, was awaiting trial for the boating accident that had killed a young woman, Mallory Beach. The case had brought a torrent of negative attention and civil lawsuits. Maggie, 52, had been living primarily at their Edisto Beach house, a strain in the marriage palpable. That evening, Alex called 911, his voice hysterical. He had returned from visiting his ailing father in the hospital. He said, to find his wife and son shot multiple times near the dog kennels on the property. The scene was horrific. Paul lay face down near the kennel feed room, hit by shotgun blasts. Maggie was yards away, felled by multiple rifle rounds. The Murdaugh tragedy instantly became a national spectacle. The prominent, powerful family struck by unspeakable violence. Alex, the grieving husband and father, was the picture of devastated shock. In the initial days, the investigation focused on the myriad enemies Paul might have made from the boat crash, or even a revenge killing targeting the Murdaugh dynasty itself. But almost immediately, the narrative began to fray. Alex's timeline was shaky. His behavior, described by some first responders as oddly composed, raised eyebrows. And then, the financial detectives began to talk to the homicide detectives. The SLED, South Carolina Law Enforcement Division agents, who for decades might have been hesitant to scrutinize a Murdaugh too closely, now found their investigation unimpeded by the old political barriers. The dynasty's shield was cracking. Part II, The Unraveling. Chapter 4, The Strange Interlude asterisk. While the murder investigation simmered, a bizarre, seemingly unrelated incident occurred on September 4, 2021. Alex Murdaugh called 911 from a remote roadside, claiming he had been shot in the head by a stranger in a truck while changing a flat tire. He survived with a superficial head wound. The story was strange and sensational, but within days it collapsed. Under pressure, Alex confessed the truth. He had paid a distant cousin, Curtis Edward Smith, to kill him so that his surviving son, Buster, could collect a $10 million life insurance policy. The suicide for hire plot, he claimed, was driven by grief, addiction, and the desire to provide for his son after the murders. The botched scheme was a catastrophic miscalculation. It shattered his credibility completely and gave investigators the leverage they needed. They arrested Smith and, more importantly, turned their full focus onto Alex. The why for the fake shooting pointed directly to a desperate man facing a financial abyss. SLED and forensic accountants began tearing apart his finances, and the century-old walls of Murdaugh impunity finally crumbled. Chapter 5, The Web Exposed. In the wake of the failed shooting, PMPED forced Alex out and disclosed he had stolen from the firm and clients. The floodgates opened. He was disbarred. Lawsuits piled up, and the criminal indictments began not for murder but for the financial crimes. He was charged with dozens of counts of fraud, money laundering, and breach of trust related to the stolen settlements. The numbers were staggering. Over $8.8 million stolen from clients and his own law firm. Each indictment peeled back another layer of the deception. The story of Gloria Satterfield's stolen insurance money became public, a particularly cruel betrayal that galvanized public outrage. The narrative of Alex Murdaugh transformed from tragic grieving father to a monstrous conman who stole from the vulnerable. He was jailed without bond, his signature navy blazer and khakis replaced by a prison jumpsuit. The kingdom had fallen, and its king was in a cell. Chapter 6, The Turning Point. For months, the murder investigation continued parallel to the financial crimes. SLED was methodical, under immense pressure to solve the double homicide that had captivated the nation. The break came from a piece of evidence initially overlooked, Paul Murdaugh's cell phone. Data extracted from the phone placed him at the dog kennels at 8:44 p.m. on the night of the murders. actively shooting a video of a friend's tail-wagging dog. In the background of that video, clear as day, were three voices: Paul's, Maggie's, and Alex's. This was catastrophic for Alex's defense. He had repeatedly and vehemently told investigators he was not at the kennels that night, that he had been napping at the main house before driving to see his mother. The video proved he was lying. His presence at the crime scene minutes before the murders, coupled with his deliberate falsehood, gave prosecutors the centerpiece of their case. On July 14, 2022, Alex Murdaugh was indicted for the murders of his wife and son. Part III, Judgment. Chapter 7, The Trial. The trial of the state of South Carolina v. Richard Alexander Murdaugh began in January 2023 in Walterboro, South Carolina, the very heart of the 14th Circuit his family once ruled. It was a media circus, a Southern Gothic tragedy played out in real time. The prosecution, led by Creighton Waters, painted a portrait of a man whose world was collapsing under the weight of his own lies and theft. The motive, they argued, was a twisted act of self-preservation. With his financial crimes on the verge of exposure, a meeting at PMPED about missing fees was scheduled for the morning after the murders. Alex killed Maggie and Paul to generate sympathy, to buy time, and to divert attention. He was a man, Waters thundered, who committed the ultimate betrayal. The defense, led by Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin, attacked the state's physical evidence, noting the lack of gunshot residue on Alex, the absence of blood spatter on his clothes, and no murder weapon ever found. They argued the investigation was biased and sloppy, focused on their client from the start because of who he was. They pointed the finger at unknown enemies connected to Paul's boat crash or Alex's drug dealings. But the heart of the trial was Alex Murdaugh himself. For days on the stand, he was a compelling, contradictory figure, charming, weepy, detailed in his recollections, yet caught in a fundamental lie about his whereabouts. He admitted to the financial crimes and the lies, attributing them to his opioid addiction, which he claimed had him in a fog. He denied, with forceful emotion, killing his family. The jury watched him closely. Chapter 8, Verdict. After 6 weeks of testimony and just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom was silent. Alex Murdaugh stood, facing the foreperson. Guilty. The word was repeated for each count: 2 for murder, 2 for possession of a weapon during a violent crime. He showed no emotion as he was handcuffed. Later, before sentencing, he gave a final, rambling statement, maintaining his innocence but saying, "I would never hurt my wife, Maggie, and I would never hurt my son, Paul." He blamed the opioids again. Judge Clifton Newman, a black jurist whose career spanned the tail end of the Murdaugh dynasty's influence, was unmoved. He noted the irony of Murdaugh being convicted in a courthouse where his family had controlled justice for so long. "It might not have been you," Judge Newman said pointedly. "It might have been the monster you become when you take 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 opioid pills. Maybe you become another person. I've seen that before." He then sentenced Alex Murdaugh to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Chapter 9, Aftermath and Echoes. The gavel fell, but the story was far from over. Alex Murdaugh was later sentenced to 27 years in federal prison for the financial crimes, to run concurrently with his life sentences. He faces over 100 state charges for the financial schemes in separate trials. The victims of his theft began the long process of seeking restitution. The fallout extended beyond Alex. The Murdaugh name, once a symbol of power, was now a byword for corruption and tragedy. The legal and political structures of the Lowcountry were subjected to intense scrutiny. How had one family wielded such unchecked influence for so long? The South Carolina Supreme Court ordered a new investigation into the 2015 death of Stephen Smith, a gay teenager found on a roadside, after rumors long swirled about a possible connection to the Murdaugh. Rumors reignited by the double homicide investigation. The legacy is one of profound ruin, a family shattered, countless lives victimized by greed, a community's blind faith in an institution exposed. The Murdaugh dynasty, built over a century on the pillars of law and order, was ultimately destroyed by the very lawlessness it was meant to combat, leaving behind only the haunting question that lingered in the humid Lowcountry air. How many secrets died with Maggie and Paul Murdaugh, and how many more were buried under the weight of a name? The Phantom of the Pacific Northwest. Prologue: The Last Boarding Call. Hello everyone, welcome to the unsettling lullaby. I am your guide into the darkest corners of the world, where shadows whisper and silence screams. Are you prepared to embrace the dark? If you're drawn to the world of true crime and unsolved mysteries, join our circle. Subscribe and enable all notifications. I am with you, and our lullaby starts right now. The rain at Portland International Airport was not falling so much as it was being hurled, a cold, horizontal barrage that rattled the windows of the terminal and turned the runway lights into smeared halos of gold. Inside, the atmosphere was one of damp resignation. It was the day before Thanksgiving, 1971, and the world was gray, weary, and eager to be home. Among the shuffling passengers for Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a Boeing 727 bound for Seattle, one man seemed to carry his own pocket of calm. He wore a black raincoat over a business suit, a neatly knotted tie, and carried a slim brown attaché case. To the harried flight attendant, Tina, he was polite, almost diffident. He ordered a bourbon and soda. His ticket, purchased in cash, bore the name Dan Cooper. He took a window seat in the last row, 18C, and seemed to disappear into the mundane fabric of travel. No one noticed the subtle weight of his case. No one saw the certainty in his eyes. He was just another man in a raincoat, waiting out the storm. As the plane climbed into the twilight, leaving the sodden Portland lights behind, Dan Cooper lit a Raleigh cigarette and exhaled slowly. He reached down, opened the clasps of his attaché case, and removed a note. He did not hand it to the stewardess who passed by. Instead, he waited. He waited until the seatbelt sign chimed off, until the cabin settled into the low hum of flight. Then he caught Tina's eye and gestured her over. He placed the note on her tray table. "Miss," he said, his voice low and steady, devoid of threat, "you should look at this. I have a bomb." The words were polite. The meaning was not. The note was typed concise. It stated that the attaché case contained a bomb which he would demonstrate if necessary. He wanted $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserve, and he wanted them waiting in Seattle. Upon landing, he would release the passengers, but the crew would stay. They were going for a little ride. Tina's blood turned to ice water. She looked from the note to the man's placid face, to the case resting casually on his lap. She saw wires, red cylinders. She nodded, a tiny, terrified motion, and carried the note to the cockpit. The calm in 18C had solidified into something terrifying. The Phantom had boarded the plane. Hash party, the negotiation. In the cockpit, Captain William Scott read the note, his veteran's composure cracking for a single stark moment. A hijacking, here, now. He radioed ahead to Seattle-Tacoma Airport and to the FBI. What followed was a tense, surreal ballet conducted via the flight's senior stewardess, a sharp-eyed woman named Alice. She became Cooper's sole conduit. Cooper was not agitated. He was not a wild-eyed fanatic with a cause. He was a businessman closing a deal. He showed Alice the bomb, a mass of red sticks and a battery, wired together with ominous precision. He was reasonable. He agreed to let the plane land in Seattle to refuel and collect his demands. He even allowed the other passengers to deplane, unaware of the drama at the back of the cabin. They filed out into the gate area, complaining about the delay, utterly oblivious to the man in the raincoat who watched them go with the detached interest of a chess player. On the rain-slicked tarmac, under the watchful eyes of FBI agents and police snipers positioned on rooftops, a satchel containing 10,000 $20 bills, serial numbers recorded in a frantic, hurried operation, and 4 parachutes were delivered to the aircraft. Cooper inspected the money with a banker's care, stacking and restacking the bundles. He examined the parachutes, rejecting the military-grade ones, opting for the civilian models. He kept the 2 primary chutes. One he would wear, the other, he said, was for a hostage he might take. With the 36 passengers gone, only Cooper and the 4 crew members remained. The plane, now a sealed, pressurized tube of anxiety, taxied back onto the runway. Cooper gave new instructions to Captain Scott: fly to Mexico City, maintain an altitude of 10,000 feet, keep the landing gear down, keep the flaps at 15 degrees, and most crucially, leave the rear stairway unlocked and unpressurized. Captain Scott knew what that meant. The Boeing 727 had a unique feature, a rear air stair that could be lowered in flight. It was designed for remote airports. Cooper was going to use it as an exit. As the plane climbed into the stormy, ink-black night over Washington state, Cooper donned one of the parachutes over his suit and tied the bag of money to his body with a length of cord. He had no helmet, no goggles, no specialized jumpsuit, just a raincoat, a business suit, and $200,000. He summoned Alice one last time. Through the open cockpit door, she could see the instrument panels glowing green, the crew's faces tense in the dim light. Cooper stood by the rear galley, the roar of the wind from the open stairwell, a deafening beast howling just feet away. "How do I lower the stairs?" he asked. Alice, her training overriding her terror, showed him the simple lever. He nodded his thanks. Then, as an afterthought, he handed her his tie and the black tie clip he'd been wearing. "A souvenir," he said, his voice almost lost in the wind scream. At 8:13 p.m., the cockpit altimeter alarm sounded, indicating the rear door was open. The plane shuddered. Captain Scott felt the change in pressure, the shift in the aircraft's trim. He got on the intercom. "Is everything okay back there?" There was no answer, only the relentless, keening wail of the night. Dan Cooper, the man in the raincoat, had stepped back into the storm. He vanished into a void of freezing rain, 10,000 feet above the rugged, forested wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. The temperature was well below zero. The wind chill was lethal. He was wearing street shoes. The Phantom had taken his leap into legend. #part II, the hunt asterisk. On the ground, the search was immediate and massive. Military and civilian aircraft crisscrossed the projected drop zone, a vast, impenetrable swath of the Lewis River Basin, a place of dense fir forests, steep ravines, and logging roads that disappeared into mud. The FBI descended, confident. A man had jumped into a winter storm in a business suit. He would be found frozen, broken, or both, surrounded by his useless fortune. They found nothing. not a scrap of parachute nylon, not a shred of raincoat, not a single $20 bill. The wilderness had swallowed him whole. The case file, labeled NORJAK, Northwest Hijacking, began to swell with frustration. The composite sketch based on the crew's descriptions showed a man in his mid-40s with a calm demeanor, a strong jaw, and a receding hairline. D.B. Cooper, the press dubbed him, a name born from a wire service reporter's misreading of the FBI files. It stuck. The name became a brand for the ultimate vanishing act. Theories flourished like moss on the old-growth trees. He was a disgruntled aerospace engineer who knew the 727's quirks. He was a retired paratrooper, a special forces vet who could survive the unsurvivable. He was a criminal mastermind who had planned every detail for years. Or he was a desperate nobody who had, in a moment of insane audacity, pulled off the impossible and then paid for it with his life at the bottom of a dark, cold river. The FBI chased down over 800 viable suspects over the decades. A charismatic con man named Richard McCoy pulled a nearly identical hijacking months later, but his methodology was brasher, his personality flashier. He was caught, and while he shared similarities, he was not Cooper. A troubled Oregon man named Kenneth Christiansen, a former paratrooper and Northwest employee, fit the physical description and had the knowledge, but no solid evidence ever emerged. A Boeing engineer named William Gossett had the skills, but not the motive. The list went on, a parade of maybes and almosts. Then, in the spring of 1978, a young boy named Brian Ingram, on a family picnic along the sandy banks of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington, waded into the shallow water. His foot brushed against something soft and crumbling. He reached down and pulled up 3 bundles of decomposed $20 bills. Their rubber bands melted into the paper. The serial numbers matched. It was $5,800 of the Cooper ransom. The discovery was a seismic event. It proved the money had entered the ecosystem. But how? Had it washed down from a burial spot upstream? Had it been scattered when Cooper's chute failed, his body sinking into a different river system entirely? Or was it a taunting clue, a breadcrumb left by a survivor who had no need for decomposing cash? The FBI scoured the area. They found nothing else. The river kept its other secrets. #III, the legend. As the physical evidence remained scant, the myth grew vast. D.B. Cooper ceased to be a criminal and became an archetype, the anti-hero who beat the system, the lone wolf who danced on the edge of oblivion and winked. He was a folk hero for the disenfranchised, a symbol of clean, non-violent rebellion in an era of political assassinations and war. He hadn't hurt a soul. He outsmarted the airlines, the FBI, and gravity itself. Songs were written, movies were plotted. Cooper conventions were held by armchair detectives and enthusiasts. Every few years, a new deathbed confession would surface, from a retired cop or a lonely hermit, each more elaborate and less credible than the last. A man claimed his uncle had been Cooper and had buried the money in a backyard that yielded nothing but old bottles. Another said Cooper was a Canadian smuggler who used the cash to fund a marijuana empire. The wilderness itself seemed to participate in the mystery. Hikers would report finding strange, weathered parachute fragments decades later, sparking feverish expeditions that usually ended in the discovery of old military training debris. The FBI officially closed the case in 2016, citing the overwhelming likelihood that Cooper did not survive the jump. But they left a tiny crack in the door, a concession to the power of the unknown. The most compelling theory, held by many of the original investigators and modern analysts alike, is also the simplest, the jump theory. Cooper, despite his calm planning, was an amateur. He had no concept of the terminal velocity of a human body in freefall, or the brutal impact of a 200-mile-per-hour slipstream. When he stepped off that stairway into the black, roaring chaos, he was likely knocked unconscious instantly, his ripcord pulled by a flailing arm or never pulled at all. His body, weighted by the money, would have struck the dense forest canopy or a river like a missile, burying itself in deep mud or being carried away by the relentless current. The wilderness of the Pacific Northwest is not just vast, it is a consumptive entity. It swallows logging equipment, whole cars, and hikers without a trace. A man in a business suit would be absorbed in a season. But the other theory, the survival theory, is the one that fuels the legend. It posits that Cooper was a professional. He knew exactly what he was doing. He picked the 727 for its stare. He chose the civilian chutes for their reliability. He had a landing zone pre-scouted, a remote meadow, a logging road, and a vehicle waiting. He endured the jump, buried the money, save for a bundle that later washed away, shed his identifiable clothes, and walked out of the woods a day later as a different man. He used the cash sparingly, wisely over many years, living a quiet, anonymous life, watching his own legend grow with a private, unshareable smile. Epilogue, the enduring storm. Today, the rain still falls on the forests of the Lewis River Basin. The same cold Pacific rain that fell on November 24, 1971. The case files are archived. The official search is over, but the mystery is evergreen. Did the phantom die in the storm, his dream of freedom ending in a final, shattering impact on the unforgiving earth? Or did he become one with the storm, using its fury as a cloak, disappearing into the American landscape with the ultimate severance package? The truth is out there, perhaps buried under decades of leaf litter at the base of a 1,000-year-old cedar, or walking beside us in a supermarket, an old man with a knowing glint in his eye and a story he can never tell. D.B. Cooper left behind no body, no clear motive, and only a handful of decaying bills. But he gifted the world something far more potent, a perfect mystery, a hole in the fabric of the known, through which the wind of possibility still howls, inviting us to wonder, to speculate, to dream of stepping off into the dark. He is the ghost in the rain, the shape in the static between channels. He is the man who got away, and in that escape, whether into death or into a new life, he achieved a form of immortality. He is no longer just a man. He is a question mark etched against a stormy sky, forever unanswered, forever compelling. The ultimate vanishing act is complete. The legend, however, has only just begun to fly. Bodies in the Marsh, the long road to Gilgo. Part I, the first thread. Hello everyone, welcome to the unsettling lullaby. I am your guide into the darkest corners of the world, where shadows whisper and silence screams. Are you prepared to embrace the dark? If you're drawn to the world of true crime and unsolved mysteries, join our circle. Subscribe and enable all notifications. I am with you, and our lullaby starts right now. The wind off the Atlantic was a cold, wet slap in the face, carrying the tang of salt and decay. It was December 11, 2010, and Suffolk County Police Officer John Malia was walking his K-9 partner, Blue, through the dense, frozen underbrush off Ocean Parkway. The air was gray, the gnarled branches of the beech plum and bayberry like skeletal fingers against the sky. They were looking for one woman, Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old escort who had vanished after a frantic 911 call from a client's house in Oak Beach months before. Blue, a German shepherd with intelligent eyes, strained at his leash. His nose, far more sensitive than any human technology, was working overtime. He wasn't tracking a living scent. He was pulling Malia towards something older, something settled into the earth. They pushed through a thicket, the thorns catching on their uniforms. And then Blue stopped, his body rigid, a low whine in his throat. There, half buried in the sandy soil and draped in a patchwork of burlap, was not Shannon Gilbert. It was a skeleton. Malia's radio crackled to life, his voice tight. "We've got remains." The search for one missing woman had just ended. A hunt for a monster had just begun. Within hours, the quiet stretch of Barrier Island became a circus of flashing lights and grim-faced professionals. The medical examiner's team moved with a somber precision, and as they carefully excavated the first site, a trooper's boot scuffed against a different patch of disturbed earth 10 yards away. Then another, and another. By the end of the week, the count stood at 4. All women, all wrapped in burlap, dumped like refuse along this lonely 4-mile stretch of highway between Jones Beach and the wealthy enclave of Oak Beach. The media dubbed it immediately the Gilgo Beach Murders. The victims were given back their names: Melissa Bartholomew, 24, Megan Waterman, 22, Amber Lynn Costello, 27, Maureen Brainard Barnes, 25, all petite, all involved in sex work, all last seen in the summer or fall of 2007, 2009, or 2010. The burlap sacks were a signature, a crude, callous shroud. The location was a dumping ground, remote yet accessible, a stone's throw from the glittering wealth of the Hamptons. The discovery shattered the illusion of safety in the beach communities. A predator had been operating with brutal efficiency, and no one had noticed. The Suffolk County Police formed a massive task force. The FBI joined. Theories abounded. A trucker using the parkway, a local with intimate knowledge of the dunes. The investigation, however, began to sink into the very muck where the bodies were found. Part II, the bog of frustration. The years that followed were a masterclass in investigative frustration. The task force, dubbed the Gilgo Beach Homicide Investigation Team, amassed terabytes of data, cell phone records, toll booth photos, forensic reports. They conducted thousands of interviews. The burlap was traced to a generic brand sold at dozens of locations. The victims' burner phones showed a pattern: final calls arranging meetings, then silence. But there was no DNA match in the national database. No clear suspect emerged from the fog of tips and dead ends. The public's fear slowly curdled into anger and cynicism. Families of the victims held annual vigils, their grief sharpened by the agonizing wait for answers. Conspiracy theories flourished, suggesting a cover-up, a wealthy killer, or a ring of powerful men. The investigators, led by a succession of determined detectives, felt the weight. They knew the killer was likely still out there. He was a ghost, a meticulous planner who left no obvious trace. He was, as one profiler suggested, a man who blended in. He could be a neighbor, a colleague, someone who appeared utterly ordinary. He was hiding in plain sight. Then, in 2022, a new wave of forensic technology and a fresh look at old evidence provided a fragile thread. Investigative genetic genealogy, the technique that had cracked the Golden State Killer case, was applied to DNA found on the burlap and on one of the victims. It didn't give a name, but it pointed to a family tree, a specific family tree. Meanwhile, a re-examination of cell phone data from the night Amber Lynn Costello disappeared yielded a critical clue: a vehicle. A first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche, a distinctively shaped pickup truck, had been captured on a security camera in Massapequa Park, near where Costello was last seen. The driver had used a burner phone to contact her. That same burner phone had been used to taunt the family of Melissa Bartholomew after her death. The family tree and the truck began to form a Venn diagram. Investigators started cross-referencing. Who in that genetic family tree owned or had access to a first-gen Avalanche in 2010? Who lived or worked on Long Island? The list shrank name by name. Part III, the man in the shadows. The name that remained was Rex Heuermann. He was 59 years old, a husband, a father. He lived in a cramped, gray-shingled colonial in Massapequa Park, a mere 5-minute drive from where the avalanche was spotted. He was an architect, running a one-man firm from an office in Midtown Manhattan. He specialized in projects for New York City agencies and large corporate clients. He was, by all accounts, a brusque, detail-obsessed man with a temper, but not someone who stood out in a crowd. To his neighbors, he was the odd, hulking guy who collected guns and complained about property lines. To his clients, he was a competent, if difficult, professional. He was a ghost in the most literal sense. He owned a vast collection of ghost hunting equipment. He was also a client of sex workers, a fact detectives confirmed through meticulous analysis of financial records and online activity. Heuermann fit the emerging profile perfectly. He was familiar with the Gilgo Beach area. His architectural work gave him a pretext for traveling to remote sites. His physical stature, over 6 feet tall and nearly 300 pounds, matched the witness description of a large client given by a roommate of Amber Lynn Costello. His cell phone records placed him in the vicinity of the disappearances. His hair, recovered from a pizza crust discarded in a Manhattan trash can, matched mitochondrial DNA found on the burlap. The puzzle pieces, gathered over 13 long years, finally clicked into a horrifying picture. The predator wasn't a phantom. He was a man who filed building permits, who rode the Long Island Railroad to work, who mowed his lawn. Part IV, Police Warrant. On the evening of July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann left his Midtown office and walked toward the 5:48 p.m. train to Massapequa. He was, as always, dressed in a suit, a large, imposing figure moving through the rush-hour crowd. He was likely thinking about work, about dinner, about the mundane details of his life. He never made it to the platform. A team of plainclothes officers from the Suffolk County Police and New York State Police closed in around him on Fifth Avenue. The scene was quiet, efficient. There was no dramatic chase, no struggle. Rex Heuermann, Suffolk County Police, we have a warrant for your arrest. He was read his rights there on the sidewalk as commuters streamed past, oblivious to the history being made. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. Maureen Brainard Barnes was named as a 4th victim, with charges expected to follow. The district attorney would later state they believed Heuermann was responsible for all 10 sets of remains found in the area, including a toddler and other victims not connected to the sex trade, suggesting a depravity even deeper than imagined. At his arraignment, Heuermann stood behind plexiglass, his expression unreadable. He pleaded not guilty. His attorney called the case circumstantial. But for the families in the courtroom, for the detectives who had carried the case for over a decade, the face behind the glass was the answer to a nightmare. It was the face of a man who had hidden among them, whose ordinary life was a mask for a monstrous secret buried in the sand. The arrest was not an end, but a new beginning, the start of a long legal reckoning. The marsh grass still whispers in the wind off Ocean Parkway, but the ghost of Gilgo Beach now has a name, a face, in a cell. The long road from that first grim discovery had finally led to a door in Massapequa Park, and the world finally saw the predator who had been standing in the light all along.